Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Mercy of the God of War. Episode 20. Cassandra. She heard Sherian scream her name, but she felt horribly far away in this cloud of dust. Cassandra tried to answer back, coughing horribly. She glanced back, and Vrihan was wiping the blood off his face. He was going to get back to her any moment now, and Cassandra was still trapped. With Miss Andra lying half dead underneath her, she was desperate to free herself. That rock on her leg was massive, and nowhere near anything she could lift with her current strength. Cassandra coughed, trying to clear her throat again. "Karen," she called. "He won't save you. I'm going to kill you, and watch him weep in front of your dead body," yelled Vrihan, from somewhere behind her. Cassandra glared at him, holding the dagger as her last line of defense. Weak or not, she was not going to let that monster approach her without defending herself. She was ready to fight him off using everything she could and all she had. Vrihan staggered, and as he lowered his hand from his face, she could see the horrible line running across his face. One of his eyes was blocked by the blood. Just like his dragon, Cassandra had also blinded one of his eyes with that same dagger. Vrihan still had one though, and was coming right at her. She shivered. She couldn't die here, not when Karen was this close. She kept calling his name and screaming, but all she could hear as an answer were the clamors of men all around fighting, and even louder was the dragon's wrestling. Another ruckus imploded from another side of the room, and a wall exploded, throwing more dust and rocks into the mix. This was a complete war scene. Cassandra. Finally. Cassandra turned her head, and in the middle of the fog, Karen's familiar silhouette appeared. She could have cried in relief from this sight, if she wasn't already too teary from all the dust. He ran to her, and as soon as he spotted his brother standing behind Cassandra, he threw out his fist. She heard the violent crack of a jaw break above her head, and Vrihan's guttural sound. The second brother screamed in pain, and turned around, running away and disappearing into the cloud of dust. If Cassandra hadn't been at his feet, Karen would have gone to finish him off. However, the war god didn't hesitate a second and crouched down, grabbing the humongous rock that was sitting on her leg. Frowning, he took a couple of seconds to focus and gather his strength before finally lifting it. Cassandra moved quickly to retrieve her leg, despite the pain. Her ankle was twisted or broken, horribly painful. Right after that, she meant to say something, but Karen's lips found hers. This was the oddest time and place for a kiss, but they couldn't stop. In those few long seconds, they just needed it. A wild, passionate, intense kiss to sum up how much they had been dying to see each other again. Cassandra felt her whole body warm up again as if it had been in slumber since they parted, and her heart had stopped. She put a hand on his cheek. She would have hugged his whole body, kissed all of his skin, and caressed his hair for hours if she could. Finally, her war god was here, her one and only man. Karen's large hand on her neck was all she needed. This warm, intense touch that told her she was finally safe, even in this wretched place. However, those seconds were short-lived. As another part of the wall exploded somewhere behind them, they had to part their lips as Karen moved to shield the two sisters. Cassandra was deafened by a dragon's screech for a few seconds. She couldn't see anything beyond a few steps. Gahad, she said, her eyes meeting Karen. He's losing. Vrihan's firstborn's dragon arrived. Cassandra's face lost its blood. Gahad couldn't fight two dragons by himself. She struggled to get back on her feet, Karen helping her, but her mind was still preoccupied. Cray. Still outside. Fighting Leis dragon. The situation was horrible. With dragons fighting all over the palace, it was a complete mess all around. Cassandra crouched down to grab her younger sister, but Karen was faster. Grabbing Miss Andra, he put her on his shoulder under Cassandra's panicked eyes. Was her younger sister going to survive this? She was barely alive. Karen. They both turned around to follow Sherian's voice. Just like them, Sherian was fighting her way more into the dusty mist than battling any soldier now. She had made a few more victims on her way in, but it took them a few more seconds to reunite, as they needed to stop and crouch down regularly to avoid the debris falling and dragon claws. Me? Is she alive? Asked the princess. Barely. We have to get out of here. Sherian nodded, but her eyes were above, on the two dragons fighting. Her eyes suddenly opened wide in horror, and something red and dark suddenly splattered all around them. It smelled horrible, and was warm, giving Cassandra no doubt about what this thing was. Fresh dragon blood. She panicked and turned around, trying to catch a glimpse of the fight, but all she could spot were shadows of two dragons fighting furiously. Gahad. Yeah, the old one is not going to last much longer, sighed Sherian, shaking her head. Come on, let's get out of here. Without saying a word, the siblings exchanged Miss Sandra's body, Sherian carrying the young girl effortlessly while Karen grabbed Cassandra to carry her. She didn't oppose him. With her injured ankle, she would have been the one to slow him down, and the imperial prince and princess could get out much faster than her. As they struggled to get out of the room, Cassandra tried to look around for Vrihan or Leis. She was scared one of them was going to come out at any moment and attack them from behind. Moreover, she was worried about Gahad. The Imperial Dragon wouldn't have gotten into this fight if it wasn't for her, and it was dying. It was its blood she had on her dress right now, on top of hers. Here. Sherian had found some opening in the wall, more like a breach where more rocks had fallen from. They climbed a couple of rocks to finally get themselves into the open air and breathe better. Karen let Cassandra down, though he wasn't letting go, his arm around her waist, ready to shield her at any given moment. In Sherian's arms, Miss Andra was still inanimate and looked like death. All of this was too much. Karen. Cassandra heard Sherian's scream, but was thrown onto the ground before she understood what had happened. Blood splattered her face, and when she raised her eyes, Karen was on top of her, making the grimace of someone who's suffering horribly. She heard a dragon's growl, and the prince suddenly pushed her further away from him. Karen, she screamed. The prince was suddenly pulled back inside, under the two women's horrified eyes. Sherian hesitated a second before putting Miss Andra down. Karen had no weapon left, and the gigantic red dragon had just dragged him back inside the room like a mere puppet. Her brother was going to die. Before they even exchanged a word, Cassandra handed Sherian her dagger, and she ran back inside. Cassandra had another objective, and no time to complete it. Getting back on her feet, silently praying for Karen to be all right, she started dragging Cassandra further away. They had to get far enough for her younger sister to be safe. They had somehow gotten back into the lake's garden. That part of the throne room's wall had gotten them right there, which was an unexpected chance for them. Cassandra! Cassandra! Cassandra turned her head and saw Anur running towards them. His eyes were wide open in horror upon the sight of Cassandra, and he fell on his knees before them. What happened? He muttered. Cassandra had no time for his questions. Get her out of here, she yelled while trying to run away on her limping leg. She didn't have time to verify if Anur was going to follow her instructions. Karen was back inside, his sister too, and both of them were almost unarmed, if not for the small dagger that was no match to face a furious dragon. Plus, she had no idea how bad that injury he had suffered before being dragged back inside was. Cassandra had seen too much blood today, she couldn't allow any more. She wasn't a fighter, but she could find a way to get them some support. She glanced up, at the chains still blocking the way into this garden for dragons from the outside. She could hear Kray's furious growls from the outside, but the black dragon had no way in. Cassandra had to get rid of those chains. Kray! Kray! She called, yelling all of her lungs out. She didn't know how the black dragon could always find her, but she just knew it would. She heard the growls and kept running. What was happening on the other side? She was unable to run fast enough with her injured leg, but her steps were getting her to the lake, as fast as she could endure. More growling came from inside the throne room's opening, but she couldn't look back. Cassandra was silently crying, unable to hold it, and breathing erratically. She was tired, in horrible pain, and terrified, but she had to keep going. She needed to do anything she could to help them. Suddenly, a silver creature flashed in front of her, agitating its little wings. Kian! The baby dragon had somehow managed to escape the mess of the throne room to fly to her, though its silver scales had much dust on them. Kian flipped his wings and landed next to Cassandra, emitting some little, worried, high-pitched sounds, while looking at her in the throne room. She nodded. I know. I know. She didn't have the strength to say more. The young woman slowly made her way to the lake, fighting the tiredness of her own body. She felt as though she was about to collapse. Finally, she made it to the lake and fell forward. Down on her knees, she fought against the dizziness and took a deep breath. Kian walked up to her side, tilting its head. Cassandra nodded. How about you? Help me call your dad. She had no idea if the baby dragon had understood her, but it suddenly flipped its wings and took off. Kian was very small compared to any adult dragon, and tiny enough to squeeze through the metallic net above them. Cassandra heard the familiar growling and chirping, probably trying to grab Kray's attention. She had no idea what was going on for the black dragon, but she really needed it to come down and help its master, now. However, the dragon couldn't do that unless it could get past Vrihan's traps first. Cassandra laid down next to the lake, extending her arm into the water. It felt strangely good, the fresh water running on her arm, washing the dirt and the blood away. She closed her eyes for a second, yet still fighting not to give in to the darkness. She had to hold on, a bit longer. The fight was not over. Above her, she suddenly heard the furious but familiar growl of the black dragon. Cassandra opened her eyes back up just as the large shadow flew over her. Cray furiously attacked the fence, but just then, she saw some gigantic metallic arrows flying that way. Probably Vrihan's traps. Cray had to fly away again, dodging them as they kept firing. The black dragon growled furiously and started spitting fire too. Cassandra frowned and shielded herself. Though Cray was meters and meters above her, she could feel the scorching heat of the fire where she was. This was terrifying. No wonder no dragon ever did that within the Imperial Palace. They would have decimated the whole building and everyone around in seconds. However, right after that, Cassandra froze, her eyes stuck looking to the other end of the lake. Another dragon had just appeared, growling at her and coming towards her, slowly. It was smaller than Cray, but this one was under the net, unrestrained and menacing. Just from the size and purple color, she knew which one it was. Hissed Leis' voice from behind her. "This time, I'm going to finish you off." Cassandra had seen enough horrors for one day, and yet it seemed like this whole nightmare was far from over. Just when an adult, purple dragon was slowly walking her way, she heard its master's voice coming from right behind her. Cassandra rolled in the grass, just in time to avoid the sword that stabbed the soil next to her cheek. She glared at Leis. She hated that man perhaps even more than Vrihan, if that was possible. His face was deformed by anger, and he had blood running from his temple to his chin. Cassandra had no idea if he had been injured in the explosion of the wall by one of the dragons, or because of the siblings, but she thought he deserved more suffering than that. The sight of that monster pushing her sister's defenseless body down the stairs was something she wasn't going to forget. "No more Karen or dragons to protect you," he hissed. "I'm going to get rid of you once and for all." Strangely, Cassandra answered his words with a chuckle. Maybe she was too tired of all of this, but she laughed nervously at his words. Cassandra knew she might be about to die, but after everything she had already gone through in the last few hours, it was at the very back of her mind. She had just seen her lover being dragged back inside the throne room by a furious dragon. She had no idea if her baby was safe, and this empire was about to be overthrown by a madman. She had just witnessed too much for one day. Having Leis appear now was like a nightmare's new twist. "Stop laughing, you crazy woman." Cassandra's nervous laugh wasn't that long, but she had no strength to get back up. She was beyond exhausted. Leis' furious expression was what kept her upright, though. He was another monster that needed to disappear. When he lifted his sword again, she got ready, and using all of her strength, she raised her arm to splatter him with water, and some mud and small rocks she had grabbed. That attack took him by surprise, and he groaned, having gotten some in his eyes. Cassandra's reflexes came back the second she realized she had a chance. Ignoring the pain, she actually grabbed his sword by its blade and kicked him in the flank. The fifth prince wasn't a fighter. That kind of move wouldn't have worked with Karen or Vrihan, but Leis was surprised by her sudden kick and made the mistake of lessening his grip on his weapon for a second. Cassandra took that opportunity, and sent the weapon flying, having it fall into the lake. She knew she hadn't time to turn it around and use it herself, but at least she could get rid of it. His eyes were red with all the dirt he had gotten in them, and as Leis fell on his flank, he quickly got on all fours to wrestle Cassandra. He was even more furious that she had even managed to pull this kind of trick on him, and made him lose his sword so easily. He raised his hand and slapped her furiously. Cassandra felt the pain resonate through her whole body, and her cheek burned. Leis chuckled from hearing her in pain, and quickly got back on his knees to pin her down, and slap her some more. It wasn't just about killing her now. He wanted this woman to suffer, for the humiliation she had just caused him. His eyes hurt, she had just made a fool of him, and he hadn't forgotten she had stabbed him either. He kept slapping her furiously, yet ensuring not to put as much strength behind them so that it would have her pass out. He wanted her to suffer some more before he killed her. "You're nothing but a useless woman. You think you can hurt me? You think you can touch me? You asterisk. You're just a asterisk, a asterisk. A slave." With each sentence came a new slap, and Cassandra couldn't even pass out to escape. Her whole face was burning, and she could feel the taste of her own blood in her mouth. She tried to struggle, push him away, but no matter what, Leis was a healthy, young man who was a lot stronger than her. She could only raise her arms to try and protect herself, but even so, he was having fun hitting her wherever he could. She felt his slaps turn into fists when he started hitting her arms, yet she endured it. She held on to the thought that she had gone through worse, that she had to make it through for her baby. For Cassian. "You're so weak. You think you can play strong? Do you think you can survive this? You're just weak, useless." Cassandra's eyes turned towards the lake, and the purple dragon that was coming their way. She could hear Cray's furious growls above, still wrestling with the chains on the roof, and the soldiers trying to injure the black dragon with whatever weapons Vrihan had gotten ready. Cassandra had to do something. No one was coming to save her, she had to move and help Cray herself. If the dragon could access the palace, Karen would have a better chance. That's all she needed to focus on right now. She purposely let Leis have his fun beating her some more, but she was thinking. She knew what to do, she hadn't gotten closer to the lake by mistake. Protecting her face as much as she could, she took a deep breath. "Sometimes it's not about strength," she whispered in her native tongue. "It's about courage." "What are you saying, woman?" Just when he had stopped to try and understand her words, Cassandra used both of her hands, with her joined fingers, to punch him in his jaw. It wasn't that strong, but it was surprising. Leis let out another painful groan, holding his jaw with a shocked expression. Cassandra then quickly turned towards the lake, and started chanting, as loud as she could, in her native tongue. "What are you?" He had expected her to try and run away, to crawl maybe, but this woman was singing loudly. Singing something he couldn't understand, in a different language. For a few seconds, the fifth prince got worried, but then, he understood. She was just crazy. He laughed, finding this way too pathetic. "What are you trying to do, witch? Ask the fish for help? Is that all you can do?" Yet, Cassandra ignored him, and kept chanting, loudly, as her eyes remained closed. Leis stopped laughing and frowned. What was this, anyway? It looked like her song from the celebrations, with that same strange language, but this one had something scary about it. It didn't sound like a prayer, more like a battle cry. A chill went down his spine, and for a full minute, he wasn't so sure. Her singing had him worried, yet he couldn't understand why. He couldn't possibly be afraid of a weak woman's singing. Cassandra stubbornly kept going, her arms still protecting her face, her voice getting deeper and louder. The fifth prince was torn. While he didn't want to be afraid of that woman, he still couldn't ignore this very uneasy feeling that was growing, as if something dangerous was about to happen. "Stop," he muttered. "Stop that! His iron de altir, bato. Yemen guerra, ten guerra. Alramin shinde, almir, li shin, li shin. Oh, God of water, rise for your daughters, rise for those they murdered, rise for your daughters' blood." Cassandra kept going, uttering her words loudly and fast, her song echoing all around them. Leis found himself staring at the surface of the lake with that worried feeling that was nagging and wouldn't go away. There was something wrong, something was about to happen. However, the surface of the lake was very quiet and calm, and he couldn't understand why he was finding himself so worried about some stupid woman's singing. "You foolish woman! You're going to die, this time. I'll..." Leis raised his hand, but just as he did, something suddenly flew out of the water. A large shadow covered them, and for a second, the prince thought a bridge had appeared above. However, it wasn't a bridge. It was a humongous, reptilian body. It was just so big that it easily overshadowed them before touching the ground on the other side. Like a gigantic snake, it came out of the water, very slowly. More and more of the reptilian body came out, seeming endless. Leis was completely frozen, thinking he might be hallucinating. Yet, what he first took for a giant snake, kept coming out of the water, and its long body crawled on the grass, circling them in its rings. Its small but palmed front paws landed in the grass very close, making him realize this wasn't a giant snake. Suddenly, a head bigger than any dragon's head he had seen turned to him. The young man didn't even dare to lower his arm, completely frozen. He was just shaking, horrified. Not even Gahad was this big, and this creature's head was awfully close. It seemed trapped with them under the grid on the roof, with just enough space. The creature looked very calm, but even the purple dragon looked worried and retreated slowly. Everything except for what was going on in the throne room seemed to get horribly silent around them. Leis was still holding his arm high up, ready to hit Cassandra, but with that thing watching him, he didn't dare move a finger. He could tell those white eyes were fixated right on him. Under him, Cassandra had stopped chanting, but unlike the fifth prince, she wasn't scared to move. She pushed him away from her, and crawled away, laying her body down into the water. It had a terribly good cooling effect on her painful cheeks, and she let the water wash away all the dirt and blood on her arms for a few seconds. Above her, she heard Cray growl again, and it made her reopen her eyes. Cassandra knew she still had to move. She turned around, got back on all fours, and slowly stood up. Just when she staggered and thought she was about to fall, a sturdy, scaled body appeared in front of her. She chuckled and leaned against the water god's body to stand up properly. She turned towards the creature's head and smiled. It was strange how calm the creature was, and how it made Cassandra feel so much calmer, too. Yet, this fight wasn't over. Next to her, Leis still had his arm held up. He hadn't dared to move. He looked funny like this, but he was glaring at her. "You asterisk," he hissed. Cassandra ignored him, turning her head up. Cray was still blocked up there. She took a deep breath, and turned towards the water god, addressing the creature in her native tongue. Leis couldn't understand any of the words she uttered, but he was speechless when it actually made the gigantic creature move. Under his eyes, the water dragon slowly extended its body up, until it reached the chains. With its little claws and fangs, the creature started pulling on the grid. While they had barely moved under Cray's attacks, the long metallic chains couldn't resist the water god's strength for long. They heard the stones they had been fixated on creaking horribly, and a portion of the roof crumbled, leaving one side of the roof open. Cray flew in immediately, with a furious growl. The black dragon was injured, 2 arrows having pierced under its left wing, but that didn't even seem to slow Cray one bit. Compared to the calm water dragon, the black one came in like a big raging hurricane. Cray jumped on Leis' dragon, all fangs out, and the two of them started fighting furiously. While the purple dragon had stood still in front of the water god, it couldn't lay down while being attacked, and the two dragons started fighting furiously. That battle scene seemed to wake Leis up. "No!" he screamed. The difference in strength was obvious between the two. While his dragon had been safe under the chained roof, it was now completely at the mercy of Cray, despite the attempts to fight the black dragon off. For a few seconds, it looked like an easy win for the black dragon, who was so much bigger than its younger brother. However, Leis' furious eyes turned elsewhere. "Come out, you cowards!" he yelled. Cassandra turned towards the shadows he was yelling at, from one of the palace's corridors. What was he planning now? One after another, she saw multiple pairs of little eyes lighting up. She shivered, understanding slowly what was going on. Young dragons lined up in the shadows. Leis was calling out for his son's dragons to help him. Rather than scared, Cassandra immediately found herself furious. That coward was forcing his children's dragons to fight for him. She turned to him, just when the little dragons started appearing in the garden, one after another. "Stop that," she said. Leis laughed, but it was a crazy laugh. "Oh no, you star! Just you wait until they rip you apart." "They are all going to die," Cassandra retorted. "They are too young. They can't win and you already know that. You're sending those dragons to their deaths." "I don't care, as long as I make it," he yelled. Leis suddenly got back on his feet and started running in another direction, away from the fight. Cassandra's anger rose again. That man was the vilest creature, and a coward at that. Not only was he running from this battle to save himself, but he was also basically sacrificing his son's dragons, allowing them to be killed for him in his fight. Cassandra exchanged a glance with the creature, but just like the Rain Tribe's people, the water god was not a fighter. It had answered her call as she begged, but what now? She couldn't ask the creature to kill young dragons either. She hated the idea of having to sacrifice innocent lives. Cassandra may be angry, but she kept a clear mind about the situation. Those poor little ones were following Leis' orders, maybe not even of their own will. Some of them were probably barely older than Kian. Half a dozen of the little dragons appeared on the grass, all coming in different sizes and shapes. She could tell how young they ought to be, and it just made it all worse. Just then, Kian flew back to her too. Landing on the grass in front of Cassandra, the little silver dragon was growling furiously at its peers, warning them to leave her alone. The difference in size didn't impress the baby dragon one bit. The young dragons weren't afraid of Kian either, but they were hesitating on coming closer, with Cassandra standing against a portion of the water god's body. Each of them kept growling and sending glances towards the water god. They were all taller than Kian, but most were not even half an adult's size. "Stay away," she warned them, using her mother tongue. Either they had understood or were scared, as the little dragons stopped coming closer or just started growling more furiously. Strangely, the smaller ones seemed to be the most eager to fight. Was it because they were influenced to follow their father's orders even more than the older ones? Cassandra glanced across the lake, where Cray and the purple dragon were still actively fighting and growling at each other. She turned her eyes towards Leis. He had barely made it halfway towards the corridors, but he wasn't too far away yet. Cassandra tried to think quickly, and soon found a solution. She ran towards the net of chains that had fallen from the roof. A large portion of it had been ripped down, from where Cray had gotten it, but one of its ends was still hanging above the walls, stretched above Leis' head. Cassandra's eyes followed his steps. The prince was running like crazy in the garden and didn't hear anything of her struggle. Cassandra grabbed some of the heavy chains a few steps away from her and started pulling on it. It was very heavy. They were chains made to keep a dragon away after all, not for a woman alone to pull down. Glancing over his shoulder, Leis saw her pulling like crazy, and looked up at the chains that weren't even moving. He slowed down to see her struggle, thinking he was far enough away, and started laughing again. "You crazy woman! Those chains were put up there with the strength of several men. Do you really think you can do anything? You're weak, useless." Right at this moment, Cassandra stopped pulling, glaring at the prince. He realized his mistake a second too late. Had he kept running, he may have made it. Yet, he had stopped while he was still underneath the chains, giving Cassandra time to turn towards the water god. "Altesque," she said. Leis' eyes opened wide in horror, as the water god raised its claw and brutally pulled on the chains. This time, the walls above him crumbled right away. With a horrible scream, the chains fell all over the top of the prince, followed by big chunks of the wall. His scream died under all the rocks that buried him alive. Cassandra heard him scream long after the rocks had stopped falling, telling her he was still alive, but suffering miserably. On the other side of the lake, the purple dragon felt its master's demise, as it started screeching horribly. Cray took the chance to jump on the screeching dragon. They had fought fiercely, and despite the difference in size, the black dragon had some worrying injuries on it. Cassandra was worried about Cray and even more so about its master, but it looked like Cray would get rid of its opponent soon. Her attention was grabbed elsewhere. When she wasn't looking, Some of the young dragons had run to the pile of rocks covering Leis, but 2 of them were still growling at Kian. The little silver dragon was growling just as fiercely as its dad, set on defending Cassandra. Though they were still small and young for dragons, those 2 could bite off her hand at once, and Cassandra didn't want to risk it. Kian! The baby dragon retreated slowly to her as she called its name, but Cassandra still couldn't leave Kian to be injured. The 2 younger dragons started running after the baby, and Cassandra was scared something would happen to it. Kian, in the water, she said, while retreating towards the water god. The little dragon, running like a silver bolt in the grass, suddenly jumped in the air, using its little wings to go and fly above the lake. The 2 bigger dragons followed easily, especially as it was flying away from the water god they feared. However, they were not done with the little dragon. One of them suddenly threw fire its way, and though Kian dodged it, Cassandra's heart went cold. Kian wasn't injured. The silver dragon glanced back at its peers, and suddenly disappeared in the water. The 2 young dragons were confused for a minute, flying above the lake and trying to spot the silver scales in the water. They couldn't follow Kian inside. They were not made to go underwater, unlike the water god or Kian. Hence, when the silver dragon reappeared, jumping out of the water, it completely took them by surprise, and furiously bit one of their wings before diving back in. Cassandra couldn't keep herself from smiling proudly. The baby dragon was learning fast how to use its unique abilities. On the other side of the lake, though, Cray wasn't done with that fight. Maybe its master's state had brought despair over the purple dragon, but it wasn't giving up. It didn't let the black dragon win, and instead, the 2 of them exchanged injury after injury. It couldn't last this way. The more Cray was injured, the less the black dragon could help Karen, and the war god was still trapped inside. The image of Karen being furiously grabbed and pulled back inside the throne room just minutes ago was still printed in Cassandra's mind. She had to do something. She turned to the water god, but it was here to help her, not injure the other dragons. Their eyes met, and for several long seconds, she didn't dare say anything. It was a horrible feeling. The water god was not one to fight. The mythic creature from all her tribe's songs, they had talked about it being a god of love, not war. It was obvious the creature's whole body wasn't even made for a fight, and it probably couldn't even breathe fire. Somehow, they were alike. Not fighters and not ones that would kill either. Her kind wasn't like that. Once again, Cassandra felt utterly powerless. What could she do? Her eyes went to the opening in which Karen had disappeared, and she could still hear ruckus inside. There was no proof her lover was even surviving the battle. "Leis, you bastard of a snake!" suddenly yelled a voice behind her. Cassandra turned around, and with shock, saw Orpheus running across the garden, his weapon in hand. The 4th prince. She had almost forgotten about him, with everything that had happened. Right as he ran towards her, another giant shadow appeared above them. The White Dragon. Without waiting for a second longer, the 4th prince's dragon flew inside through the opening she had created earlier and started attacking the purple dragon too, relieving a bit of Cray's burden. The black dragon stumbled aside, blood flowing on its flank. Cray was still furious and growling, but obviously in need of that little break too. After a few seconds of rest, the two of them jumped on Leis, the purple dragon again, with the clear intent to finish him off. They were both bigger and stronger, and this time, the purple dragon was completely defeated. Bitten furiously at the throat by Cray, dragged on his back, the purple dragon died in a horrible screech of pain. That sound was unbearable to hear. Cassandra shuddered, unable to look that way. Meanwhile, Orpheus finally reached her, just when Cassandra fell on her knees. Though the fourth prince gently held her shoulder as she almost collapsed, Orpheus had his eyes riveted on the water god, in shock. The peaceful creature was looking down at him, strangely calm compared to everything going on around them. What is that thing? I don't have time to explain, exclaimed Cassandra, grabbing his clothing, panicked. Have you seen my sister? Yes. I met Anur on the way, he was carrying her out, he told me what happened. Lady Karine, she went to hide with your child. But Cassandra, we have a bigger problem. What? Femera, he said. The girl, that woman we took out of the cell, it really is Vrihan's younger sister. Your sister made her talk, she told us everything. That bastard had been impregnating his younger sister like a cow to try and breed more powerful dragons. What? More dragons? Cassandra went horribly pale. She suddenly remembered Fitra's words. Vrihan's secret, why he couldn't kill Fitra yet. Vrihan doesn't only have 2 sons. He's got more dragons stashed away somewhere. Cassandra's heart went cold. More dragons? Her eyes went to Cray, still staggering and trying to lick the injuries. Next to it, Phe wasn't too bad, but the white dragon had gotten an injury on its shoulder too. Meanwhile, Kian just jumped out of the water, running on the grass as the other 2 young dragons that had targeted the baby dragon were struggling to swim their way out of the water. Their wings had been completely destroyed by the silver dragon's repeated attacks. Cassandra couldn't rejoice in the slightest. They only had 3 to help them, including a baby one that had hatched only a week ago. How could they fight more? How could Vrihan have even gathered more dragons without anyone knowing? She turned to Orpheus, her energy ignited by panic alone. How many? Where? She didn't know where her sons and their dragons had been taken. Vrihan hid the sons and their dragons from her. He killed the girls before they were even born. That explained the abortion potion they had caught the young princess buying at the market. As soon as there was no egg to hatch, they knew it was a girl, and Vrihan ensured they ended the pregnancy. Cassandra felt like throwing up. Vrihan was even more of a monster than she had fathomed, and she was even more defeating him. If a man like him got on the throne, it was truly going to be the end of this empire. We need to find him or where he hides his sons and their dragons, she whispered. I thought he was fighting Karen inside, exclaimed Orpheus, pointing at the opening. Cassandra shook her head, getting back on her feet. No. No, Vrihan fled in the confusion. Only his men and his dragon are still there. He probably went to get his son's dragons, then. Who knows how big they are? We have to find them then. Cassandra nodded, but how? She saw Cray and Phe running towards them from the other side of the lake, joined by Kian. She had to think quickly. How could she find the young dragons inside this wretched palace? It was so big. She looked around, and her eyes fell on the lake. She turned towards the water god, who seemed to be patiently waiting for her to ask. She let out a long sigh. Cassandra, called Orpheus, confusion lacing his words. I know what to do, but... You may want to take cover, she whispered. The fourth prince was utterly confused. He had only truly known Cassandra for a few hours, it seemed, yet that frail-looking woman was shattering all of his expectations, one by one. He couldn't understand. There was a giant half-snake, half-dragon-looking creature basically wrapped around her, and he had no idea what that creature was. Or more importantly, why it seemed to obey the young concubine. He glanced towards the side as Cray and Phe were walking around the lake to come to them. He was also in awe of the fact Cassandra had basically almost managed to kill Leis by herself. Cassandra turned to the water god and spoke to it in that strange foreign tongue of hers. Meanwhile, the screams of pain coming from Leis could still be heard, and Orpheus kept his hand on his sword. If he was still alive, he could still heal. He was ready for his fifth brother to come back at any moment. Strangely, he was actually a bit more concerned about whatever the young concubine was about to do. She looked like she had gone, really. She was covered in so much blood and dirt, not much of her skin was white anymore. Her hair was all over the place, and her dress had even been ripped in several places. Not to mention her ankle, which had turned a horrid dark purple color. Cray and Phe finally reached them. Both dragons were covered in their siblings' blood. Cray was limping a bit as it came to Cassandra, and lowered its head to sniff the baby dragon that had just jumped out of the water. The young concubine didn't have much time for the black dragon, as she struggled to get to the lake. A bit at a loss on what to do, Orpheus helped her, though he was frowning. What are you going to do? Look for them. The water god will help me. He still had no idea what she was actually about to do, but seeing how sure she was, he didn't dare protest and just nodded. Cassandra slowly got into the water, followed by the baby dragon, who looked excited about going back into the lake. For Orpheus, it was also his first time seeing a dragon actually enjoy itself in the water. Once Cassandra had half of her body immersed in the water, to Orpheus' surprise, the gigantic creature decided to follow her back inside the lake. The fourth prince stumbled back, almost falling on his own dragon, as the snake-like creature rolled its long body back inside the water. It was a strangely silent and imposing creature. Only Kian was overexcited, swimming and jumping around in the water like a pond fish. Even Cray looked confused. The black dragon had its front paws in the water, looking at the young concubine and its offspring, yet not following them as they went in deeper. They got into the water in seconds, but it felt like long minutes to Orpheus. He had hidden Femera with Anur and the younger sister, after Anur had found his way around the palace to protect them. But Orpheus wasn't feeling good about any of this. No one could ignore the horrible sounds of the battle still raging inside the hall. It wasn't a good sign at all. His attention was caught closer to them, as Leis kept blaring under all of his rocks. His son's dragons were struggling to get him out of there, but it was only a matter of minutes before they succeeded. The fourth prince frowned. Phe, he called. The white dragon immediately turned towards the little ones, growling. It only caught the attention of a few of the young dragons, but Phe started going their way anyway. Orpheus was making a dark expression too. Cassandra may be too nice and gentle to kill the young dragons, but he wasn't the same. All the siblings had grown side by side with death. He knew exactly what to do. Still growling, the white dragon started climbing on the little mountain of rocks, and suddenly jumped on the first younger dragon, killing it with one bite. Leis was buried deep underneath, but Orpheus had no intention to bother digging his younger brother out to finish him off. The truth was, he'd rather not dirty his own hands. Instead, it was satisfying enough to have the weight of Phe climbing on the rocks add to his suffering. With a bit of luck, that would finally crush him to death. Meanwhile, Cassandra had finally swum to the middle of the lake. Even if swimming was easier for her, the amount of pain her body had endured already made every muscle ache. Yet, she had to hold on, for Karen's sake. He was fighting his own fight inside that hall. She had to fight her own battle. The young woman took a deep breath and dived. Kian and the water god followed her under the surface. She actually grabbed one of the water god's horns as it swam next to her. The creature didn't seem to mind, and took her deeper under. Once she felt like she was deep enough, Cassandra closed her eyes, and with her mouth closed, started singing. It was a song she never thought she'd use, one that wasn't made of lyrics. At best, it was only like several long sounds, like a siren of some sort. However, it used the deeper layers of her voice, ones that echoed in the water. Sure enough, the water god quickly reacted to it. The creature started making deep sounds, echoing Cassandra's. There was no comparison. Its voice was much deeper and much louder. Soon enough, it started resonating all through the lake, sending gigantic sound waves throughout the lake. Her eyes still closed, Cassandra had to stay focused to listen to the echo. She had never done such a thing before, she had only witnessed it, when she was much younger. Years and years ago, she remembered watching the members of her tribe, diving in the water and all together, using their voices to find where the wood of their shacks was getting weaker, where the fish were, or where to dive to hunt. It was a skill she had never practiced herself, but she remembered it well enough, apparently. She could feel her own heartbeat slowing down, as if to let her listen. She could feel the water around her shaking. Cassandra had suspected the water god's voice would be louder, much louder. She would even have trouble staying where she was, if it wasn't for her holding on to one of its horns. Next to her, Kian seemed rather amused by the situation, chasing the large air bubbles that left the creature, and swimming to follow the echo waves. On the surface, things weren't as calm. To Orpheus' surprise, the surroundings of the lake had started trembling shortly after the young concubine had disappeared underwater. While he wanted to trust her and that creature she had summoned, gods know how. It started to worry him a little as the whole ground under him began shaking. One could tell the epicenter of those strange waves that shook the whole area came from the lake, and Orpheus began to worry. Before he could call her out though, a huge portion of the roof, a few meters away, crumbled down. It was already fragile from the earlier struggle of the iron net being torn down. But now, all the walls around were trembling. Is that what she meant by taking cover? Taking cover looked rather deadly at the moment. The white dragon was still absorbed by its little hunt in the rocks. The smaller dragons had quickly understood that their survival was linked to whichever hole they could squeeze themselves in. While Phe had caught the biggest and killed them already, the smaller ones had managed to crawl under the rocks and hide themselves, though they could still be heard growling and struggling. However, there wasn't any time to play, as the whole garden was dangerously shaking. After another heavy shake, the white dragon finally jumped down from its little playground, and went to its master. Phe extended one of its wings over Ophius' head, growling at the shaky walls around them. Cray, too, was growling, but the black dragon wouldn't leave the border of the lake, its ruby eyes fixated on the surface. Ophius frowned, feeling the whole palace tremble. What was this crazy girl doing now? How long could she hold her breath underwater anyway? After everything that had happened today, he felt like he owed it to her to help keep her alive, but there was truly nothing he could do when she was going on a swim with some oversized snake. To his surprise, the little dragon suddenly jumped out of the water, and flew with a long chirp to Cray, happily reuniting with its parent. Right after that, Cassandra suddenly emerged from the water, struggling to swim. Ophius ran to help her get out of there. She was drenched, and though it had helped wash most of the blood and dirt away, her dress was weighing heavy. "Are you all right?" asked the fourth prince, glancing at her, completely confused. "What was that?" "It's the echo, a technique used by my people to locate things. Anyway, I know where they are." "You do?" "I located several younger dragons, somewhere southwest of here, in a very large building, something like around 1. Their eyes lit up at the same moment, as they both realized what that building was. "The arena," whispered Cassandra, astonished. Of course. He needed somewhere big enough to put all the dragons, along with what he needed to trap them. Vrihan went to free all his little bastards from the arena. The question was, how many dragons were they talking about? Cassandra felt a shudder going down her spine. She turned towards the Great Hall, where the fight was still raging. The truth was, her heart was begging her to go there and help Karen fight off the red dragon. However, she knew she'd be useless there. Sherian was already inside to help him, and Cassandra would be nothing but a hindrance. Suddenly, just as she hesitated, a part of the wall she was watching burst out, and something violently flew their way. For a second, she thought she was going to die like this, killed by the humongous projectile object. However, Ophius jumped on her, and a shadow immediately covered them. Cassandra closed her eyes by reflex, and a horrible uproar burst around them. It felt like a bomb had just exploded behind them. The two of them were thrown onto the ground, and Cassandra felt some of her injuries get worse. Phe. Gahad. Nothing could have awoken her up more efficiently. Cassandra opened her eyes, and some blood dripped on her cheek. A dragon's thick, warm, and dark blood. She struggled to sit up, and realized the large shadow over them was one of Phe's wings. The white dragon had jumped in at the last minute to protect them, taking most of the hit. Cassandra crawled to get out of there, and finally see what was going on. Ophius had been quicker to get out of there. The fourth prince helped her up, but the two of them had to face the horrible scene. Gahad had been violently ejected from the Great Hall, and the golden dragon was covered in blood. Its battered body landed next to the lake. Cassandra felt her heart go horribly cold. Gahad had really been defeated. Had it gotten weaker because of its master's disappearance? The old dragon was breathing with difficulty, and Kian was the first to run over, with worried little squeaks. Meanwhile, Cassandra turned to Phe. The poor white dragon had protected them, but had collided violently with Gahad and gotten injured. One of its wings was horribly ripped open, bleeding and broken in several parts. Orpheus looked devastated, running to his dragon to comfort the poor creature. Meanwhile, Cray growled and ran to Cassandra's side. The black dragon's growls were directed at the ruckus that was still going on inside. Cassandra shivered. Gahad defeated, it meant Karen and Sherian were alone to fight the red dragon. Vrihan was really going to win this if she didn't act quickly. She turned to Cray, grabbing one of the dragon's horns. "Cray, we have to go to the arena," she said. "Quick!" She hoped Karen could hold on a bit longer with Sherian's help, but for now, she really needed Cray. Neither Phe nor Gahad were in a state to fly anymore, and she wouldn't make it to the arena by herself. The black dragon growled furiously, and Cassandra climbed on its back. They took off immediately, headed southwest. "Cassandra!" yelled Orpheus as she was already off the ground. "Stay with them, I'll be back." The fourth prince watched the concubine go, with a heavy heart. She was really going to do this on her own? He grimaced and turned to Phe, who was already getting back on its feet. The white dragon may have been in no condition to fly, but it could still attack. Orpheus, too, grabbed his weapon, and headed for the pile of rocks. When you have to, you have to. It felt strange, to fly back to the place where everything had changed for her. Cassandra could feel her nervousness rise as the black dragon flew towards the Imperial arena. Was she scared to go back? Did she hate this place? Surely it's a bit of both. It didn't bring back good memories, except for the moment she met Karen. However, before that, there was only death. The many, many people whose deaths she had witnessed. She could still remember it all too well. Dozens of slaves, running in all directions, and being violently killed by the 6 imperial dragons. 6 dragons, 6 princes. Among them, the only one who had sealed her fate, Karen. She still couldn't really understand the forces that had saved her life that day. Were his feelings for her really something so strong that Cray had felt it before its master even had set his eyes on Cassandra? It sounded like something out of an ancient tale, and yet it was her life. For Cassandra, that was all it had taken to end years and years of suffering. She had wanted to die in that arena. Not for those people's pleasure, just because being killed by a legendary beast was one way to end an insignificant existence. "Come on, Cray," she whispered. She couldn't ignore all the blood covering the black scales. Though it seemed fine flying, the black dragon wasn't as strong or as powerful as usual. Cray was tired from the fight with Leis dragon and the soldiers outside. How could those dragons, considered as gods by her people, simply be seen as weapons by the Empire? Not only was she dreading going to the arena, Cassandra had also left a part of her heart back inside the palace. Karen was still fighting, by the sounds they heard coming from inside the hall. At least, She hung on to that hope. That the furious dragon growls were proof that neither was dead yet. She had no idea how long a war god could withstand against a dragon, and she was even scared to think about it. At least Princess Sherian was with him. Cray finally arrived above the arena. Strangely, maybe because she was seeing it from above, the arena felt smaller than when she had come here, over a year ago now. Cassandra's nervousness increased again, as Cray started the descent. She was basically unarmed, except for the adult dragon that accompanied her. They landed softly in the middle of the arena, and Cassandra had to take a deep breath to chase the memories resurfacing. She kept her hand on Cray's warm scales, bringing her some comfort. She truly hated this place, but she was sure the young dragons were here. Why had Vrihan subjected his own sister to this? What justified such a despicable, immoral act, like the rape of his own blood? A sudden movement caught her attention on the left, and Cray started growling as well. One of the heavy doors that led to the cells opened, revealing two dragons. Cassandra gasped. Those didn't look like the usual dragons, though. More like creatures that had come out of a mix between a nightmare and a horrible mistake. The first one had half of its head missing, as if it had melted down, and breathed heavily, its maw open and drooling. It was walking awkwardly, with its front paws having a noticeable difference in size. The neck was a strange shape as well, and it had scales missing in some spots, exposing horrible, brownish flesh. The second one wasn't any better. It was the fattest, yet shortest, dragon Cassandra had ever seen, and its wings were obviously too small to support its weight. It had a strange arched back too, like a hunchback. Both dragons didn't even come close to the beauty of a proper dragon, like Cray or the water god. Those two looked like they had come out of a children's bad drawing of a dragon. "What are those?" she whispered. "Aren't they amazing?" chuckled a voice behind the dragons. Cassandra stepped back. Vrihan appeared from the shadows, coming out slowly. His face bore the horrible injury she had inflicted on him earlier, the flesh still ripped open in the middle of his face. It wasn't bleeding anymore, but the reddish scales were obviously struggling to appear on such an irregular surface. The second prince looked like a reptile was trying to take over his face, and his left eye was behaving strangely too, as if it couldn't fix itself but was still trying. He was almost as scary and deformed as the monsters he had created. "You're crazy," she whispered. It seemed like he had heard her because he broke into a burst of mad laughter that echoed throughout the arena. Cassandra frowned, completely lost by his crazy behavior. Next to her, Cray curled up around the young concubine, arching its back and growling in a warning for the two monsters not to approach them. The scary thing was, no matter how horrible they were to look at, those two things were still rather big. The little ones Cassandra had fended off before were nothing compared to these two. These two dragons were between a third to half of the size of Cray, and unlike the black dragon, they looked up for a fight. She glared at Vrihan. The second prince was slowly walking her way, his mouth distorted with what should have been a smile. "You, the witch of some lost, meaningless tribe, you really should have died in this arena. Isn't this ironic? We are about to set things straight. You'll finally be dead, as you should have been, and my brother will go back to being childless." Cassandra saw red at those words. The mere thought of that man touching one hair of her baby's head was enough to turn this gentle woman into the fiercest of warriors. She was never going to step back, as long as she could stand between him and Cassandra. Meanwhile, the dragons kept growling at each other, and Cassandra couldn't help but glance at them again. "How could you do such a thing?" she hissed. "To your own sister." "My sisters," he laughed. "Do you know what my sisters are? My sisters are nothing but mistakes. They are useless things, unless they serve me." "That's right, even slaves are more useful than those things you call my sisters. How can you say such things? About your own family?" "My family? The only woman that ever mattered to me was my mother, and even she was a crazy. The only thing she did good in her life was keeping me alive. She gave birth to 5 daughters, and she loathed each. But for me? I was her son. Her only boy, the one she had to protect at all costs to ensure her own survival." Cassandra suddenly remembered Sherian's words. Their mother was a former prostitute. Phaedra had gotten furious when Sherian had reminded her of that fact. The prince kept talking, coming closer and closer to her. He looked like he was strangely calm, or in some sort of trance. He had never been so scary to Cassandra. She wanted to run away, to not be trapped here with him. Yet, she knew she couldn't. There was no one else left to hold him back from going to the palace, or to Cassandra. Orpheus Dragon was injured, and Cassandra knew he wouldn't be able to match up to his older brother. He had to take care of Leis first. Karen and Sherian were still stuck with the Red Dragon, and she hoped Anur was protecting Miss Andra, Lady Karine, Cassandra, and even the poor Femera. It felt like the end. Finally, this feud was coming to an end. All the hatred that had stayed concealed was coming out into the open, all the brothers picking sides and fighting each other. "What was it all worth, all this?" said Cassandra, glancing at the monster dragons. "Your sisters, your children, even your father. You've sacrificed everyone, simply to become emperor." The second prince laughed. "To become emperor? No, I did it to survive. My crazy mother went for me to survive. Every single day, I had to see it. She killed servants that tried to harm me. She begged my father for his attention, just in the tiny hope he'd give her another chance to give him a son. My father was the worst of them all. You think I used my sisters? That man used my mother as a pawn, a mere toy between him and his favorite woman." Cassandra frowned. She had mentioned it. Lady Karine had talked about something like this. How the emperor got closer to other women, even got engaged to them to try and get her attention. Cassandra had never thought twice about that. She was nothing but a toy he would toss aside whenever he could. My mother was constantly begging, dying for a second of attention, making herself the most pitiable woman. She cried more than any woman can cry, she screamed, she begged endlessly. She was such an annoying thing to see. She was a crazy. A useless. Cassandra was shocked. She had never thought being a concubine was easy. She knew how hard some of them fought to get the emperor's attention. How some killed and got killed. Cassandra was well aware of how lucky she had been, in this nest of snakes, and she had always kept in mind those women were mostly fighting for their survival. She had never thought about how one woman could actually lose her sanity over this. Lose herself. Can you believe, she was actually stupid enough to love that man you call my father? She believed his lies, she was ready to do anything for him. She taught me one thing, and one thing only. Survival. I had to survive, I had to become his only son. I had to become the emperor, and she'd do anything for me. My mother dirtied her hands more than anyone, and she taught me everything I needed to know. It was quite fun, sometimes. When she wasn't completely crazy, she wasn't totally dumb. Cassandra wanted to vomit at each sentence he said. Deep in her heart, she understood how a woman could have lost herself in her attempt to get the emperor all to herself. How she could have become absolutely insane with jealousy and paranoia, and took her children down with her. Vrihan wasn't born a monster, he had been purely created by his mother's madness. She could hear it in his voice. He wasn't crazy. He was just a child born out of resentment and hatred. It was so easy, once you understand the rules of the palace, you know. It was a game for me. Kill, but don't get caught. My mother let me kill the servants that displeased me, or she'd do it herself. She hated my sisters so much. She killed 2 of them, and the others quickly understood if they weren't useful to me, they might as well be dead, too. Their mother had killed her own daughters? It was such fun. If I ordered it, my sisters killed anyone. I was already the emperor of my own palace, and they were my servants. Feature was the smartest one. She always did whatever I asked, so I kept her around. She even ordered the others, understanding what I wanted before I even knew myself that I wanted it. It was fun, seeing them thrive, just to keep me satisfied. Vrihan looked at the 2 horrors next to him, suddenly frowning. I thought I'd be father's favorite in no time. Sephir was going to die anyway, and the others were meaningless. I had forgotten about Karen. Cassandra suddenly realized. Lady Karine had kept her children away from the imperial palace to keep them safe. After what had happened to her oldest children, and to the young Karen, it was a wise decision. It meant they had mostly grown away from their siblings, out of Vrihan's sight. The second prince's eyes got darker, reliving some memories he obviously didn't appreciate. I knew the one woman my mother hated most was Karine. The one woman my father truly loved. My mother killed her eldest, but she killed my mother as revenge. I was at a loss. I couldn't understand why that woman couldn't be killed, like she had done to my mother, killing her so openly. Plus, if that wasn't enough, she still had managed to have more children, and another son. That was the one woman I couldn't get to kill. If our father discovered I killed one of Karine's, I knew I would die. It was the one game I couldn't play without risking my own life. So the Emperor's love for Karine had saved them, buying them some time after all. After Vrihan's mother's death, the young murderer had understood he couldn't kill his siblings and get away with it. Sherian and Karen were protected, more so than their other siblings. Cassandra couldn't even begin to understand what monstrosities had taken place behind closed doors at that time. The monsters their mothers had created, all for their survival or greed, for one man. Suddenly, Vrihan shook his head. So, I finally understood. I had to find a way to be better than him. To have the strongest dragon, the most children. I needed to be the best prince. The one my father would have no choice but to choose. Cassandra was torn between disgust, horror, and compassion. A part of her was hearing Vrihan's story and seeing it through her own eyes. Once pulled into the Dragon Empire, she had always thought there was something wrong with it. She had thought even more so when she had met Karen, his mother, and heard their story. This imperial palace was the scariest place in the empire. Filled with beautiful women, treasures, all the food and gold one could want, and endless rivers of blood. This kind of place wasn't an environment for children to grow up safely. It was a place for them to kill or be killed. Her people had an expression for that. The river may not taste like the sea, but it doesn't get sweeter. No one could completely be free of its birth condition, and no child born from the imperial palace could be born without blood to be shed either. It was an endless circle of vengeance, jealousy, and death haunting those golden walls. How could they pave their own way of staying free of all violence in those conditions? Vrihan had been raised under his mother's madness, and therefore became the monster one woman's tortured mind created. I have done everything. I became the best in everything, he yelled. I was the smartest child, the strongest, even the one with the largest beast, and yet, when that bastard came back, all of it was for nothing. My father only saw Karen and his dragon, nothing else. None of us mattered. He gave him the best opportunities, the best chances. Even giving him an army, so he could come back after that victory and be acclaimed by anyone. Vrihan's anger shone through in every single word he spat. He had become about as red as his dragon and didn't bother to control himself anymore. Cassandra looked at him, standing a few paces away, but she was also still nervously keeping an eye on the monstrous progeny. Cray was growling in a low tone, but its arched back and visible fangs made it clear the beast was ready to attack as soon as she gave the word. That jealousy between the siblings was no different from their mothers. They all longed for their father's attention, and a chance to survive. Yet, Vrihan was the one who had gone too far, who had fallen into this hole without any chance of repair. Cassandra knew this tone of voice, it sounded like despair and madness, molten together. It was always about Karen, the prodigal son, the war god, Karen's son. Father was blind any time that woman or her children were in the room. Even his sister mattered more than us, his sons. Cassandra remembered seeing Sherian stand like an equal amongst her brothers. She was the only princess allowed to do that, but part of it was because she had taken that right for herself. It wasn't Karen or the emperor who had given her a chance to talk and dispute her brothers, to stand above her sisters. The princess had chosen to stand her ground and become as strong as she needed to be. She had made her own way in life. Sherian couldn't have gotten that strong, or became able to discuss matters of the empire on par with her brothers or her father's council, simply because she was the favorite daughter. On the contrary, she may have become the favorite daughter because of everything she had worked hard to achieve. Vrihan was simply blind and deaf to her actions, just like he was to his own sisters. He couldn't see a woman as a whole human being, only as a thing to be subjected to another man. To a father, a brother, or a son. Just like her mother, Sherian had long decided she was more than that. Cassandra didn't think it was simply her education that had molded her, it was her nature. He didn't have to do anything, he always came first in everything. The minute he was born, Karen became the nemesis of my life. You're wrong. After all of his screaming and whining, Cassandra's soft voice took him by surprise. The second prince looked at her, looking a bit lost for a second. He probably didn't think she'd even dare talk back, but there she was. The young concubine wasn't even afraid. She was standing tall, backed up by the strongest dragon alive, and she was not about to step down. She wasn't impressed or scared by him. Cassandra had found in herself the very same feelings she had the last time she stood in this arena. She wasn't afraid to die, she wasn't afraid to stand in the face of a man-killing monster. A lot of things had changed, and she was stronger than before. She wanted to survive this time, but she was also ready to give her life to save her loved ones. She wasn't scared in the slightest, a strange halo of quiet was with her. You're wrong, she repeated. You saw what you wanted to see. Karen never had it easy, none of your siblings did. You're talking as if he had cheated, but you're the one who took this for a game. You nurtured your own jealousy after what your mother had experienced. You could have ended it years ago. You could even have saved your mother and your sisters, but instead, you played this game of death and you had fun until you didn't. Vrihan's face was getting more and more distorted with rage as she spoke. Cassandra's composure was even more of a slap to his face. He couldn't stand a woman talking back to him, without any fear in her eyes, and he couldn't stand her being Karen's woman. He wanted to gouge her eyes out. Those eyes that looked at him like he was a pitiful thing, or a crazy animal. Those green eyes that judged him. You could have led a good life if you had stopped all this, Cassandra continued. Your mother was the one who caused the havoc, but you happily followed her into madness, and you even pushed all the blame onto her. You used her. At least she had her love for you and the Emperor as an excuse. But, you? You didn't have any real reason to inflict all the damage you caused. No one forced you to kill people, abuse your sisters, or even fight your brothers. You could have spared many lives, but you just relished in your power until someone overshadowed it. It didn't even have to be Karen or Sherian. You needed a bone to pick and you found one. Vrihan clenched his fists and his teeth, so furious he looked like he was about to explode. You ignorant witch, he shouted. You think you know the ways of the palace? Do you think you have any idea how cruel that world is? I was merely a child. I only followed the path my mother had. I was a child too when I was captured, said Cassandra in a very soft and low voice. I suffered. I saw all the people I loved killed, tortured, raped, and sold by men I didn't know. I saw dozens of young girls like me, crying and suffering. I cried and I begged, too. I was whipped so many times, I thought I'd die. I was cut so deep I know the color of my own bones. I also experienced despair and anger, and it did not make me into a monster. The second prince looked at a loss for words for a few seconds. Then, he scoffed. You were merely a slave. You were insignificant, you were bound to be killed anyway. You couldn't rebel. However, if you had the chance, just once, to hold the whip and torture the one who had done this to you, tell me you wouldn't have done it. Tell me you would have remained all pure and innocent. Do you think I am a monster? We are all monsters then. No one held the whip for you, retorted Cassandra. He blinked, having lost what she meant. This time, Cassandra simply looked disgusted at him, and resolute. The concubine shook her head and put her hand on Cray's neck as she stepped forward. No one inflicted you such suffering, you're the one who caused it. You mimicked your mother's craziness. You don't deserve to even compare yourself to any victim. You and I, we are not the same. You only inflicted pain on others, but you never suffered enough to know the full extent of the pain you caused. You just used it as an excuse to justify yourself. I am the victim. I wasn't born to be in someone's shadow. It is my throne. No one knows what I went through, I did what I had to. Don't judge me, you slave. You know nothing. I am the new emperor, the only one that matters. His madness was beyond saving. Cassandra realized that as she watched him scream, shout, and empty his lungs dry. This man had already sealed his own fate several times. There was no use in saving a fool running towards his end. Even if it wasn't for all those reasons, Vrihan was not one that could be saved. Cassandra glanced towards the damaged dragons that were still growling at Cray. It was nothing pretty to see. Those things were never supposed to be created, yet they had been born out of one man's madness and a woman's suffering. The vision of Femera's terrified eyes came back to her mind, giving Cassandra the conviction she needed. Enough, she said. It ends now. All of your madness, your schemes, and all the pain you inflicted on others. The prince scoffed. Ha! Do you think you can stop me? You, the slave woman? The White Witch? I knew you'd be a problem. Ever since Karen saved you from this arena, I should have gotten rid of you faster. It's high time I get rid of you, you're an eyesore. Just as he yelled those last words, the dragons suddenly got more agitated, growling loudly and running towards Cray. The black dragon didn't move, staying close to Cassandra, but when the young dragons reached them, Cray was ready. The sound of the first attack resonated throughout the arena. Cassandra dived down to cover her ears, as one of the dragons growled even louder, right above her. A dragon's growl could be as soft as a purr, but it could become a deafening siren when they wanted to be heard. She rolled to the side, blinking through the dust clouds the gigantic bodies had stirred. So it had begun. She could hear Cray's anger unleashing, but she couldn't stand around. She could be crushed at any moment by their weight, or get scratched by a dragon's claw if she wasn't careful. While Cray had done its best to protect her, the black dragon couldn't focus on Cassandra when it had to fight two of those dragons. She had to get out of there, as the fight was bound to get messy. She struggled to escape, as she was keeping an eye on the fight between all three dragons, while not making the mistake of finding herself in Vrihan's reach. She wasn't losing sight of the main enemy. Cassandra knew she couldn't match up to Vrihan in a fight, but she ought not to lose him for a second time either. She had to find a way to end this. The second prince didn't look willing to fight yet. He didn't have a weapon, and his face still bore the horrible scar of the injury she had inflicted upon him earlier. However, his dark eyes were absolutely burning with rage at her, and the deathly aura around him wasn't good either. Vrihan wasn't even bothering to look at how the dragon's fight was going. The gigantic creatures were making a deafening ruckus, yet he wouldn't even glance their way. He was focused on one thing. He stepped forward, making Cassandra shiver uncontrollably. She had gone out of the dragon's reach, but she was only a few steps away from the enemy, and perhaps she would have wanted to fight the dragons more. You. Everything went off track because of you, he hissed. If you hadn't pushed those ideas into him. If you hadn't bore his bastard. Cassandra glared at him, as she tried to get back on her feet. Her leg was horribly painful, and all of her body was sore, but hearing him insult Cassandra gave her a new wave of courage. As he came closer, she grabbed some of the dust around her and threw it at him. Ah! You asterisk! He shouted, rubbing his eyes and stumbling back. Cassandra took those precious seconds she had won to get back on her feet and hurry in a different direction, heading towards the cells of the arena. She didn't even have enough strength left to run. There weren't many doors open in the arena, but she had remembered enough from her short stay in the arena cells to remember which to take. She couldn't fight Vrihan on her own, but she could buy some time if she could at least find a decent weapon. She remembered the shows at the arena, specifically the warrior fights. Though their participation may not have been voluntary, their choice of weapon was, they had to have been able to pick them from somewhere around here. Maybe some could have been left inside the cells. Trying to forget the impending death chasing after her, Cassandra rushed to the cells. She knew Vrihan would kill her, slowly and painfully too. Karen wasn't here to stop him, no one was. Her only ally nearby was a dragon that was already fighting two other horrid creatures. Cassandra knew she had to fend for herself, she'd have to save herself. As soon as she reached a cell, her memories brutally resurfaced, like a nightmare haunting her. She remembered being dragged there like all the other slaves, thrown on the filthy grounds of the cages with no water, and no hope of survival. She could feel the weight of the chains on her limbs and neck, like a phantom. She took a deep breath and pushed the fear aside. They were just empty cells now. Cassandra had to squint to find her way inside and around. Prisoners destined to die had no use for light, so there was only the bare minimum here. A few rays were barely able to make it through the minuscule openings between the stones that composed the grounds of the arena. She tried to remember where to go, but every cell in there seemed like it was the same, only the contents changing. Putrid smells hit her as she hurried between them. It was like something left there was rotten and decaying, adding on to the long-forgotten excrement. She felt like throwing up, it was the absolute worst. Everything was filthy, but she had no choice other than to hold on to the bars to keep herself going without falling. Vrihan was still following her, closing the distance between them. She could hear his footsteps, making her heartbeat accelerate. Cassandra couldn't fathom dying in here, it was a horrible place to die. I swear, when I get my hands on you, I'll tear you limb from limb, and hang you from the palace's gates for all to see. The White Witch of the mountain will be no more. The way he spoke her nickname with such hatred left a bitter taste in her mouth. But Cassandra was trying not to listen to him, she was finding a way out of there. Anything to survive this. Where were those weapons? She could clearly remember people waiting to fight, receiving their chosen weapons from the jailers. While they were trained fighters and not slaves, they were insistent that they use these sanctioned weapons, something about the arena and security. But it was all a lie, Cassandra knew. She had overheard the jailers laughing about it, discussing how the improperly sharpened and dull blades would make the fights last longer and be more bloody. It was horrible that they couldn't even be granted a swift death. Cassandra didn't necessarily need a properly sharpened weapon though. She didn't have the skills to fight an imperial prince. She just needed something that would, at the very least, allow her to defend herself. Anything at all. You're so pathetic. You can't even do anything without a man to protect you. You're nothing without him, just a slave. You should have died quietly like the rest of your filthy people. Vrihan's words were echoing along the halls, like a shadow threatening to devour her at any moment. His voice was bouncing off every wall. Cassandra couldn't tell where he was or how far behind. She didn't want to even think about it. Fear would only slow her down, but hope made her faster. Finally, she spotted it, a pile of weapons randomly thrown against a wall. Cassandra ran towards it and started rummaging through. She even cut herself a couple of times in her frantic search, but she needed to find one she could handle. Many of them were too heavy for her to wield, and she really couldn't afford another disadvantage while fighting off the prince. As she heard his footsteps closing in, she settled on a small sword. It was a different shape than the one a man would normally use, being thinner and lighter than the others, but she had no time to find another weapon. While Cassandra pretended to look through the pile of weapons, she was really paying close attention to the sound of his steps. He was getting closer, and she was going to be ready for him. Her only chance would be if she could take him by surprise. She tried to calm herself and focus. She couldn't afford to panic now. She couldn't die like this, not here, not now. I. As he was almost upon her, and she was ready. Cassandra dodged to the side, and in the same movement, swung her weapon towards him. The prince let out an agonizing scream as she saw something fly away. She had no idea what it was until she noticed Vrihan's hand covered in blood, missing some fingers. You! Asterisk, he uttered between his teeth. She had managed to injure him just enough that he lost focus for a few seconds. Cassandra retreated until her back hit a row of bars. She had hit another cell, and for a second, despite the screaming, she heard something else. She turned her head, and sure enough, there was something there. Something big that was breathing very slowly. What she had taken as some airflow through the long corridors before was actually from something breathing. A dragon's breathing. She felt a drop of sweat run down her spine. More of Vrihan's monstrosities? Or? Sire, she called out. She could barely recognize the magnificent creature as it moved forward from the shadows. It had lost so much weight. The blue dragon opened its eyes to look at her and she could tell there was so much sadness in them. So this was where the dragon had been. How did Vrihan even get the first prince's dragon in there? This cell looked so cruelly small for the large beast. Cassandra extended her arm to try and reach it. Its scales were barely warm under her touch. The dragon looked like it had given up on life, just like Gahad before. They were bound to a life of despair once their masters were gone. She had no time to console the blue dragon, though. Vrihan might have lost a few fingers, but the red scales had appeared just as quickly on his skin to seal the injury, and his madness only intensified after that. His face was so deformed by his rage and injuries, he looked more akin to those horrible creations outside, barely human anymore. Seeing him approach, Cassandra tried to move to the other side of the bars, holding on to them to keep herself from falling. She heard Sire growl behind her, as it recognized her assailant too. With its anger rising, the blue dragon had a surge of adrenaline at seeing the second prince. Cassandra continued retreating until her shoulder hit a wall, cornered now between it and Sire's cell. She bit her lip, desperate. Finally, the madman hissed. "Here we are. A perfect place for you to die. In a filthy cell. It suits you, slave." They each raised their swords and Cassandra's was abruptly knocked from her hands in one swift movement. Just as she heard the metal clink on the stone floor, she crouched down as his blade violently dug into the wall right above her ear. She was completely cornered and weaponless now, holding her arms up to shield herself even though she couldn't possibly endure another assault. Her resistance was futile. You're finally going to die, you. This time, he didn't have the opportunity to finish insulting her. Cassandra raised her head as she felt something warm drip on her hands. Vrihan was paralyzed, his face frozen from shock, as the dragon's claw retracted from his throat. Cassandra was so stunned by the gruesome sight, it took her a few seconds to realize his shoulder was pierced as well. She slowly glanced to the side. From the cage, Sire had suddenly lunged forward to extend its claws through the bars. Vrihan had been so focused on Cassandra and insulting her, he likely didn't even notice the dragon's presence lurking in the shadows. His body was now amply perforated by Sire's claws. Gasping for air, he began making some horrible sounds and groaning, as if he were about to start coughing up blood. Cassandra covered her mouth with her hands. Was he going to die? However, the dragon started getting agitated in its cell and wriggled itself around violently. Cassandra saw the walls behind suddenly start to shudder under the pressure. Could the blue dragon break out of this cage? If she could manage to get Sire out, it could help Cray. "Sire, keep pushing, please," she yelled as she ran for her little sword. As the dragon retracted its claws, Vrihan was left holding the gaping holes in his throat and shoulder with his own hands. The dragon blood was trying to heal him, but the pain was so bad that he couldn't even stand straight and he stumbled trying to get to Cassandra. He was in a nightmarish condition, and his bloodshot eye was clearly giving away what he was about to do next. The young concubine didn't even have the time to be scared. She had her sword back, and as he approached, she held it up defiantly to defend herself. While Vrihan had dropped his sword, he was still coming for her, his hands bare but he still had a clearly murderous intent. The situation was unconscionable. With Sire going berserk behind them in its cell, the dragon threw itself against the walls, its cries and screeches were deafening. Cassandra slowly retreated, keeping an eye on them. The gusts of dust coming from between the stones left no room for mistake. That wall could easily burst from the angry dragon's fit. It would just take a bit more. Ugh. It was all going to depend on the timing. If she could hold him off for just a little bit longer. Vrihan approached slowly, no longer looking even remotely human. There was nothing left but a wrathful monster, out for blood and covered in it himself. She tried to control her sword and swung it in his direction when he came too close. She silently begged Sire to hurry up. She had one last crazy idea, and it might be her only chance to survive this. You die. He thrust his hand at her, still missing half of his fingers, but Cassandra managed to raise the blade just in time to protect herself. The second prince violently snatched the blade from her, cutting his hand in the process, and letting out another guttural screech. A cold shiver ran down her spine and she felt the control over her weapon leave her. Vrihan had torn it from her hands and thrown it out of reach, across the cell. Cassandra realized she was about to die. Her eyes went towards the wall a final time as the stones started to give way. About to collapse, even the roof above them was now raining dust and little rocks. She felt his hands brutally wrap around her throat. She gasped for air, fighting the violent pressure of his grip. He was strong, so strong she was sure her throat was about to collapse. Through the haze, she heard a furious growl from somewhere in the distance. Finally, he gasped through his still damaged throat. The evil grin painted on his face, with his bulging eyes and ravaged figure, would be the worst sight to die to. Cassandra brought her hands up to grasp his wrists, desperately struggling to loosen his grip. Her lungs were already painful, but now she couldn't even manage a puff of air, she couldn't breathe at all. Her throat was so raw, she felt tears in her eyes. Suddenly, a horrible ruckus resonated behind them. She saw Vrihan turn his head, panicked, right as the wall behind them started to collapse. Cassandra closed her eyes for a split second that seemed to last forever. As if her life was flashing before her, she saw her son's adorable face frowning like his dad and staring at his little dragon plushie. She saw Kian jumping around in the water and running towards Kray to play. She saw Sherian and Kareen, sitting together in the garden and laughing, and she saw Karen lying next to her in bed, whispering words she wanted more than anything to hear again. Cassandra opened her eyes again, resolute, and in a desperate final attempt, she held onto his wrists as tightly as she could and pulled them both under the crumbling walls. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.